Hi, I'm Tomas Guevara, and this is your channel Rewriting Reality. To understand who we are, it is necessary not to forget our history. Subscribe to this channel to be aware of our reality. In today's 30th episode, we will recall the history of the LGBTI movement in Costa Rica. This information is available in the editions of Ancora magazine, in the newspaper La Nación of June 25, 2017, and July 2 of the same year. The journalist was Jose Daniel Clark Camaño, and the editor was Dorian Diaz. It starts like this: Pedro was born in 1859, and from the age of 12 he wore women's clothes. Despite his beard and mustaches, in Guanacaste he is considered female, said the newspaper La Information in 1910. She sewed, embroidered, and did to perfection all the jobs that at the time were considered typical of women. The news article with politically incorrect language talks about how this person is accepted in their community, explains trans activist and university professor Mar Fournier Pereira. Probably, Peter, it would be more accepted at that time than it is now. Violence and discrimination are the reality of many people who, within the broad spectrum of diversity, both sexual orientation and gender identity, do not belong to the heterosexual or cisgender majority. For decades, these diversities have been repressed and censored. Pedro was not the only trans woman in the country, nor was Shavila Vargas the only Costa Rican lesbian who emigrated to Mexico in the early 20th century. Most of these people, their lives and stories are unknown, almost all buried forever. This is a story that is just beginning to be told. It's a challenge. That history of sexual diversity before the 80s is still a gap, says historian Jose Jimenez Bolanos. These people who do not fit the traditional molds of gender and sexuality have always been part of Costa Rica, even long before they were the identities we know today. Not only have there been ambient places since the middle of the last century, where same-sex couples danced together, but since then rumors have spread about sexual orientation or gender identity of personalities. From figures of art and culture or businessmen to former presidents, priests, and archbishops. For society, what is not seen does not exist, although it likes to criticize a lot on it. There are as many stories as people live them. Recovering this historical memory becomes a necessity to understand the political and social demands of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans and intersex people. Moreover, it is necessary to rescue it to understand those parts of Costa Rican history that do not conform to the ideals of peace and freedom that we traditionally proclaim. Repression. The riots over the police repression of June 28, 1969, which we commemorate around the world with pride marches. This Sunday, in San Jose, the March of Diversity happened in New York, led by trans Latina and Afro-descendant women. However, the repression was replicated around the world. For decades, diversities were linked to crimes, corrupt attitudes, influences from the United States, Jimenez says. In his investigations, Jimenez has found reports in Costa Rica, since the 60s of the so-called raids, in which mass arrests were made at meeting points of gay men and trans women. Sexual contact between two people of the same sex, a kiss or dancing, was a disrespect for morals and good customs. For example, Professor Luis Paulino Vargas mentions that, in his hometown, Zarcero, they found two men having sex. Not only were they sentenced to do communal work, but the community assaulted and humiliated them. In issue 104 of People magazine, it is detailed how in a raid in the 60s, the arrested men were shaved by the police. When their boss asked why, they were fired. Some lesbians who in the 70s began to go out of private spaces to bars or canteens, had to adopt traditionally masculine attitudes to defend themselves. From this historical perspective, I see it as a way to survive a more conservative Costa Rica than the one we have today, reflects Emma Chacon, a lesbian activist and researcher. To prevent their clientele from being arrested, during the 70s and 80s, bars turned on a red light bulb when the police arrived. This indicated that they had to change dance partners so that they were all male and female. However, trans people were not allowed to enter gay-lesbian bars, explains activist Natasha Jimenez. Some bars had signs that said, "Transvestites are forbidden." With the appearance of the AIDS epidemic in the 80s, repression increased, and the bulk of Costa Rican institutions turned against at-risk populations, whom they saw as a threat. This repressive response only increased stigma and misinformation. Sick people were kept in the San Juan de Dios hospital, in a basement. No doctor or nursing assistant attended them, says Natasha Jimenez, who was a volunteer there. That basement was chaotic, it smelled bad, it was dirty, people were unattended. While this was happening, La Nación recorded raids on homosexual centers in the news section. In 1987, researcher Jacobo Schifter pushed for the publication of a paid ad that would later be known as the April 5 letter. For activist Francisco Madrigal, this was a political mediation with which personalities from the Costa Rican public sphere, culture and academia demanded an end to the raids. The repression continued in different forms, but the government had to lower the intensity of the operations. The need to address the problem of HIV/AIDS in the face of government inaction also forced the most affected populations to organize, for example, in the Association to Fight AIDS. In April 1990, the realization of the two lesbian feminist meeting of Latin America and the Caribbean put Costa Rica on the world news for 2 months. The activity was hampered by pressure from the Archbishop of San Jose and an order from the Ministry of the Interior to prevent the entry into the country of women who entered Costa Rica alone. During the lockdown, a group of men threw stones and sticks at the participants, something Emma Chacon describes as one of the most difficult, strongest and most violent nights I have lived so far. Organization. After several years of unsuccessful attempts, in 1995, the National Registry approved the registration of the Pink Triangle Association, one of the first dedicated to working on sexual diversity beyond health issues. The organization opened offices in Alajuela, Limón, and San Jose. However, they were victims of constant police harassment and vandalism. They tried to burn down the house in Alajuela, Madrigal says. A few years later, the association disappears due to the wear and tear of public exposure. However, many other L.G.T.B.I groups were born during the 90s, which deepened the process of organization and training that began by obligation in the 80s. After many years of crawling, firm steps began to be taken demanding human rights that had long been denied. The consequent empowerment marks a before and after in the history of the L.G.T.B.I movements in Costa Rica, a history that, as we continue to write it, we must rescue. For many Western countries, the end of the 20th century marked a turning point in the history of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans and intersex movements. Costa Rica is no exception. While the 80s were characterized by identities still under construction and state repression, by the end of the 1990s there was a greater organization of populations to face the different problems. During that decade, public opinion debated whether lesbians had the right to assemble, whether gay men were fit to be police officers, or whether they could wear earrings and long hair on college campuses. The red light bulb announcing the arrival of the police at gay-lesbian bars went out forever, but the raids turned to harassment, and the same violence of previous decades continued against trans women in the streets. I speak of a moment of citizenship. Multiple civil organizations in favor of sexual diversity begin to emerge, says historian José Jiménez Bolanos. The Humana Collective and the Latin American Institute of Health Education and Prevention appear, among many others, as well as dialogue and self-support groups such as Tertulia Entre Mujeres. In addition, the Constitutional Court and the Ombudsman's Office were created, which become two fundamental institutions for the channeling of discontent, claims and demands, says Jimenez. This can be seen in two rulings of the Constitutional Court at the time, which declared the raids unconstitutional, as well as the one that forced the Costa Rican Social Security Fund to provide antiretroviral treatment to people with the human immunodeficiency virus, HIV. For Francisco Madrigal, founder of the Center for Research and Promotion for Central America and Human Rights, the organizations saw the need to train ourselves in political advocacy and public administration, and to generate evidence that could collaborate in the struggles of the LGBTI population. In this way, research is being carried out, as well as awareness-raising activities in the public sector and meetings with heads of institutions. The difference with trans, also, during the 90s, in developed countries the term trans begins to consolidate as an umbrella for different identities that did not fit into the traditional binary of man and woman. Although it takes time to arrive, in Costa Rica it also makes a difference. Trans researcher and activist Mar Fournier Pereira explains, "It is difficult to understand oneself and explain oneself to the world when there is no word to name oneself." Before the acceptance of the term as an identity, trans women were called transvestites. Fournier Pereira mentions how they themselves, for a long time, named themselves queers, although they felt like women. More organizations, with the turn of the century, new entities arise and others are consolidated. In 2005, one of the first to address the issues of diversity and identity beyond gay and lesbian, Malabi, was born, with a work focused on trans and intersex people. At the same time, and after living a few years in Ecuador, the activist Abelardo Araya returned to the country. Abelardo had the characteristic that he could move the media as he wanted, says Chacon, one of his comrades in struggle. This assessment is shared by fellow activist Luis Paulino Vargas. Abelard was the only one who dared to go public. I have to admit, I was terrified of being in the press as Abelardo was, says Vargas. Except for journalist Marcelo Castro, who came out publicly in 2000, in those years it was not common for people to openly express a sexual orientation or gender identity dissident to the traditional. Much less seeing same-sex couples holding hands, as, occasionally, can now be seen on the streets of the capital. The communicator Margarita Salas remembers how she and her first girlfriend were expelled from bars, restaurants, parks, libraries, monuments, for walking hand in hand or kissing. "What a pity that happened to you, you should take better care of yourself," people close to Salas told her. Since 2003, small diversity festivals began to be held, which were important steps in visibility. However, in the beginning, no more than 500 people arrived, recalls Francisco Madrigal. Diverse kisses. The fear of going out publicly was challenged in 2007, when 3 bars were denounced for discrimination against same-sex couples. The complaints, which were circulated through email, culminated with the first Diverse Kiss tour. Salas, one of the organizers of the demonstration, recalls that a patrol followed them all the way. "They didn't know what to do. I always ask myself, what do the police do when someone wants to kiss another being?" Kissing each other in public is not illegal, says Paulina Torres, also founder of the group, and one of the victims in those first complaints. Making that first manifestation of kisses was somewhat tense, mainly for fear of arrests. Torres recalls that some older activists told them, "We support you, but you do it." Others even told them, "What you are doing is going against the activism." The first Diverse Kiss tour had more than 100 participants and no one arrested. Milestones. In the 10 years that have passed since then, there are a lot of important milestones for the LGBTI populations, from the ruling of the Constitutional Court that prohibited the holding of referendums on human rights issues, to the decree for the elimination of discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity in the public sector. The coming out of the closet of the Deputy Carmen Munoz, the March of Invisibles, the presentation of equal marriage and gender identity projects, as well as the annual realization of the Diversity March are other important points. All these processes of visibility, street demonstrations and institutional advocacy have been key to the realization of some demands. However, for these populations, the state has paid off only a small part of the debt it has. Same-sex couples still do not have full access to the same rights as heterosexual couples, and disrespect for trans people's gender identity drives them out of public spaces, work, and health and education systems. Many L.G.T.B.I. people in rural areas are forced to migrate to the capital. Trans women on the streets are daily subjected to attacks with stones or even shots, and intersex people at birth are subjected to surgeries where their genitals are mutilated to normalize them. To understand the importance of these outstanding balances, it is essential to know the origin of the entire debt, and that we can only do by recovering these stories. To understand who we are, you should watch the video about the orientation, published on June 29, 2023. In that video I explained that the orientation has nothing directly to do with gender. Orientation is not directly about sexuality. However, the belief system concerning duplicity, which affects orientation, is immense, as we will see in another episode. Duplicity is the belief that most affects us and involves a tremendous amount of energy, hence its great affectation. Now returning to orientation, we must understand that orientation and gender are two very distinct elements. They are not the same. Therefore, the term cisgender should be erased in all languages. We create two physical forms as well as two biological genres in this dimension. However, we have forgotten that we created three orientations, and that is why orientation and gender are not synonymous. We create 5 external senses for perception. That is, 5 areas for experience in this dimension, which influence our reality and the mechanism of perception in the creation of our reality. In summary, we have 5 different elements that are composed of male, female, and 3 orientations. Our direction is not gender-oriented, yet our belief system brought these 2 elements, gender and orientation, together in such an efficient way that it has created too many differences that we have not yet been able to resolve. The 2 genders and the 3 orientations are 5 areas in total. These 5 areas are as different as our 5 external senses. That of sight, touch, taste, smell, and hearing. These 3 orientations are not interchangeable, nor are the external senses, that is, the sense of taste is not interchangeable with the sense of hearing. Likewise, the 3 orientations are not interchangeable either. Before you are born, you choose the orientation that will dominate your life in this reality and dimension. An example, you can identify yourself as a girl, and you can be a girl, and you won't necessarily be of the female gender. To be born into this reality or earthly dimension, we must choose the gender, that is, male or female. But we must also choose one of the 3 orientations, common, intermediate, or soft. Do not forget to subscribe to this channel. Very soon I will publish a video about AIDS.